Okay, so Broncos 2021 came in with a win total expectation of 8, went under, went 7-10, 8-9 ATS, lost bettors almost $500 on the spread and money line. Pythag had them around 9 wins, so underperformed. Our Pythag 2.0 also had them around 8.5, 9 wins. We can see, like with the Raiders, this team was quite volatile starting off. And this is something, again, we almost sound like a broken record, Judah. Start off as a particular position, kind of, the market freaks out, thinks we needs to reprice them rapidly because we are wrong. And then there's this slow drip lower back to where you started. And that preseason prior was actually quite strong. And that, you always want to adjust on a week-to-week basis based on the matchup and all the other variables at play given at that particular moment. But this is the type of demonstration of where maybe you don't really want to abandon your preseason priors over the course of the season. In fact, maybe it should strengthen in the second half of the season, particularly if you have high conviction in that preseason prior, and to not abandon it so quickly. Now, we know the Broncos got hurt and there was other things at play, but I think that the Broncos never really materialized into, I think, what many people thought that this team could be. That Teddy Bridgewater, the same argument is really what with Russell Wilson coming to town this year, was when Teddy Bridgewater was coming to town last year, he's the missing piece. He's going to provide stability to this offense. He's going to be able to let the team rely on the strength of the defense, and the offense is just not going to create turnovers, not going to put the defense in a vulnerable position, and they're going to be able to win a lot of games that way. We know Bridgewater got hurt as well, but he did not perform the way the market was pricing him to perform. And even though they started off hot, I'm very surprised the fact that the market reacted so strongly, because this is one of the most pathetic first 3 wins that you could possibly imagine. Giants, Jags, and Jets. You've proven nothing. You've proven that you yourself are also not one of the worst teams in the NFL. That's it.
Yeah. I disagree with you on the Teddy Bridgewater take. I think the question last offseason was, Teddy Bridgewater's a game manager, right? Can we go 10-7, 9-8, make the playoffs on the backs of our elite defense with Vic Fangio as our defensive coordinator? I don't think they were expecting Teddy Bridgewater to be the savior. And I think Teddy Bridgewater actually outperformed his expectation. Certainly from like an EPA perspective, he was like 15th best quarterback, which is kind of exactly what you'd hope for. I think the question this offseason is not about can we win with our defense, but can Russell Wilson unlock our offense? Which is we've got a lot of very talented receivers who've shown promise but haven't actually produced very much. Cortland Sutton and Jerry Jeudy, KJ Hamler, and when they had Tim Patrick, a bunch of guys who had a lot of promise but hadn't actually produced on the field. And the question now is, can Russell Wilson unlock that? It's a question of the offense rather than the defense.
And the defense also isn't necessarily the same defense, and they're already bleeding players on offense.
That's certainly true. There are a lot of question marks, and I think the defensive point is actually very important. I happen to think defensive coordinators are the most important asset, if you want to call them, of anyone on defense. I think they play a pivotal role, especially when it comes to coverage. I think the Vic Fangio loss really should not go overstated as a brilliant defensive mind who almost created his own way of defense, which we'll talk about with Brandon Staley as well. But losing that should... We have a push and pull here, which is like Russell Wilson's probably going to make this offense better, but is the delta of that going to overcome the defensive losses, not only from their personnel, but also from losing Vic Fangio?
Did anyone bet the Ravens in week 4?
I bet the Broncos.
The Broncos
I didn't bet the Broncos. I stacked them in DFS against the Ravens. And it was my highest. It was like I was so excited for it, and it was a disaster. This actually, I think this chart reminds me of an interesting question of like, how do you almost deal with teams who like blow out bad opponents? I think the Broncos are a good example and a good reminder that it probably doesn't really mean much, even if you're winning by enormous margins.
No, in fact, I think that's always a great opportunity to capitalize on the market's overreaction function, when teams are dominating bad teams. Beating the Giants, Jags, and Jets, who were three of literally the three worst teams in the NFL, not just at the beginning of the season, but even by the end of the season. It demonstrates that you're not in their class. So all you're saying is you're not one of the worst teams in the NFL as well. You're a class above that for sure. Which one is still TBD. You don't know if you're weeks really underperformed. But I think you make a good point too, Dan, is there's not really too much that we can really take away from last season's Broncos to try to frame the issue for 2022, because you have huge turnover at the most important position on the team. And while I think Russell Wilson's best days are behind him, there's an argument out there that his injury was the primary reason why he performed as poorly as he did.
Before I disagree with you, Brett, like, people were saying Russell Wilson was washed at the end of 2020. It was a whole discussion. It was a very commonly held belief that Russell Wilson was done after 2020, well before the finger injury.
So it's a longer term trend, in fact. Not
I'm
even
saying
just
it's not. It's like
yeah.
this has been going on for years.
And they're right, because he didn't play well in 2021. And is it all driven from his injury? It definitely could be. Could be. But I'm going to say it's not. And I'm not going to say he's a bottom 5 quarterback by any means, but he's not a top 10 quarterback.
Russell Wilson has been wanting out for a while. Whether or not he admits it is a different question. But Jay Glazer now for 2 years in a row before he got traded, he mentioned Russell Wilson wasn't happy with the team. He wasn't happy with Pete, and he wanted out. Don't be surprised if he gets traded. So how much was it Russell Wilson being hurt, and how much was it he really just didn't want to be there? It's something I can't answer, but he definitely didn't look right at that.
I think that's fair. I think the question with Russell Wilson is his context, right? Is the delta between how much worse he got bigger than the upgrades in context, which is like getting away from a Pete Carroll offense, just like being in an offense where you're not strapped because you're never going for it on fourth down, which I think will change. He never went for it on fourth down in Seattle. He also knew that he had to play a conservative game because that's what was being asked of him. And Russell Wilson loves to throw the ball deep. He loves that. What if he's taking 7-8 shots a game deep and he's better than anyone else because he's still going to throw that deep ball? And the Broncos offensive line should at least be fine. If you want to look at like their block rates, like they were 10th best according to PFF in pass blocking, right? That should count for something. I think Dan makes a great point that like there could be some human element motivating factors that were having him playing worse in Seattle because he wanted out.
Yeah. I would hope that's not the case, because basically you're saying he's a crybaby. And that, yeah, he's going to let it dictate his performance. He's going to sabotage his team and his own reputation in order to expedite his exit.
But what do you make of the context question?
Are the Broncos better than the Seahawks?
Is the delta of Russell Wilson's decline so much greater than the upgrade in context that he's getting?
I think it could. Yeah, I think it could be.
We're going to find out.
Yeah.
Are they going to let him air it out deep?
I feel like he's definitely lost a step with respect to, he's always been smart around like not taking hits, and he's not necessarily like a run first quarterback by any means, but certainly mobile enough to move around. And I think he's certainly lost an aspect of that in his game as well, which is certainly not tied necessarily, again, unless it's like some downstream effect from his injury, like decision making, so therefore puts him in a worse position than he otherwise would be in and whatnot. But his like pocket awareness has not. I just feel like he is deteriorating, and that happens to athletes sometimes. Some athletes deteriorate faster than others, and I think he's right at that point. He's been talking about how he wants to play like Tom Brady level amount of years. And if that's the case, he can't take any more hits. Then he's got to play a Tom Brady type game where Tom Brady, as we know, has great pocket awareness and always positions himself properly to not take devastating hits. And if that's the case, then he's got to make different, more conservative decisions if he really wants to play another 10 years in the NFL. So maybe that also has something to do with it as well. Like, I want to play the next 10 years, so I need to change my game if I'm going to play the next 10 years as well.
That's interesting.
But do I want to bet heavily that Russell Wilson is going to be bad? No. He could definitely still have a nice dead cat bounce. He's in terminal decline, but he has like a one good year, then it's back right down. So let's look at the Broncos 2022 schedule. And coming in with that 10 wins, plus 260 to win the division, minus 145 to make the playoffs. Favorites to make the playoffs, despite being the third ranked team in this division. Plus 1,800 to win the Super Bowl. Pythag 2.0, no bet. Ostensibly the 16th hardest schedule. Net rest, positive 9 days, and a mean spread of about -2. So favorite of being 2 points on average. Start off versus the Seahawks. That's a nice way to start. Texans week 2, not a bad encore. And then you got the Niners at home, go into the desert to play the Raiders. And then you got Colts and Chargers. Those are tough back-to-back games. And then go into the bye with Jets and Jags. That's a pretty favorable first 7 games there.
Keep in mind on some of those games too. Jacksonville game, I know it's labeled away, and then their away team here, quote unquote, that's in London. You can also see a clear divide the last 6 weeks versus the first 12 weeks in terms of difficulty. Ravens, Chiefs, Rams, Chiefs again, Chargers. You have 3 to 4 divisional opponents the last 6 weeks. You have Ravens, who are going to be fighting for seeding purposes in the playoffs. The Cardinals, Cliff Kingsbury and Kyler Murray. Is Kyler Murray going to stay healthy? We know the Cardinals really struggle in the back half of the season. But if the Denver Broncos are 7-4, 8-3 coming into week 12, they're probably going to win this division, just because I don't know if any of the other teams are going to be able to keep up with that. So if you're doing anything with overs or unders with this team, you got to be wary of the first half or the first 12 weeks versus the last 6 weeks.
Yeah, that's a huge dichotomy, and it's going to make it difficult to evaluate the Broncos after 10 weeks, because they're ostensibly going to play, looks like, one of the easiest first 10 games. And then you're going to go into a gauntlet. Ravens, Chiefs, Cards, Rams, Chiefs, Chargers. So if the Broncos are like 7-3 and they beat the Seahawks, Texans, Raiders, Jets, Jags, and Panthers.
The only way I'd be backing the Broncos in the second half of the season, because this schedule really does look promising, is if Russell Wilson has taken the next step. Or this team could easily sleepwalk to a 7-3 record with Russell Wilson playing meh, in which case the market's probably going to be up on them. And like we've seen so many times, the market comes up just to come down. And I want to be ahead of that curve, which is the information that needs to change is that Russell Wilson needs to be really good. And they're 7-3, not on the backs of sleepwalking, but on the backs of Russell Wilson playing like he is playing in 2018.
What I would say too, Judah, is if Russell Wilson's fine, if last season was an aberration, totally due to injury, and he's going to be the let Russ cook of, 2019 or whatever, then the Broncos are going to win the division. Then the plus 260 looks very attractive, because they're going to be probably more like 9-2 going into that division stretch. And you win 2 games out of the final 6, puts you at 11. And that's probably be good enough to win the division. And if you get vintage Russell Wilson from the Broncos this year, vintage, then I think the Broncos are the best team in this division, especially with this setup, because this allows you to work out all the kinks, develop chemistry, all that and whatnot. And if you're going to play a tough schedule, you might as well play it in the back half of the season.